Welcome to the Vincent Centre for the Public Understanding of Economics and Entrepreneurship. This talk is about globalisation and inequality, a good news story. There is a great deal of evidence that the modern era of globalisation has allowed huge numbers of people to escape poverty and improve their quality of life. That is not surprising. You would expect incomes to grow as trade increased and more countries became integrated into the world economy. What is perhaps more surprising, and certainly less well known, is that inequality is falling in the world, perhaps for the first time in industrial history. Almost every headline you see about inequality suggests that the world is becoming a more unequal place. I guess no newspaper owner ever got rich by printing good news. In 1820, around 90% of the world's population lived on less than $1.90 a day, adjusted for inflation and differences in purchasing power. That's shown by the red part of this graph. Another way of putting it is to say that until 1820, nearly all the world's population were just one bad harvest away from malnutrition. The proportion in dire poverty then fell very slowly in the next few generations. It was still around 40% in 1980, but by 2015 had reduced to 1/4 of that level. By 2015, less than 10% of the world's population lived on less than $1.90 a day. In other words, about as much progress was made in reducing world poverty between 1980 and 2015 as in the whole of the world's previous economic history put together. Just to bring home how recent widespread dire poverty was, as recently as the 1850s, around 1/4 of the population of Ireland died or emigrated to avoid starvation as a result of failed potato harvests. That is 1/4 of the population of one of the countries that made up the United Kingdom and which today is one of the world's richest countries. What is really interesting, though, is what is happening to inequality. If you are a young person today, you have lived through a period when there has been a bigger fall in absolute poverty than in the whole of world economic history put together, but you're also living through the first period ever when there has been a meaningful reduction in global inequality. This trend of falling inequality is likely to continue until 2035 at least, as a result of poor countries catching up with rich countries and because of the really problematic demographics in richer countries that will lead to the relative size of their working population falling, whilst the opposite will happen in countries that are currently poor. The story of the last 40 years is that the rich have not been getting richer very fast, and in some cases not getting richer at all, but the poor have been getting richer very fast. This chart shows the distribution of incomes in the world at 3 points. The top graph shows the world's income distribution in 1800. Everybody was desperately poor. The faint red line is the subsistence income level, and as we've seen, about 90% of the world's population was below this. The middle graph shows the world's income distribution in 1975. It's as if we lived on two different planets. Indeed, we used to talk about the first world, the rich world, and the third world, the underdeveloped or poorer countries, and the second world, the communist world, at one time, as if we did indeed inhabit 2 or 3 different planets. Today's situation is in the bottom graph. The vast majority of the world's population had pulled itself over the faint red absolute poverty line by 2015. Perhaps more importantly, we all seem to live on the same planet. The income distribution of the world looks like the income distribution for an individual country. And inequality has reduced in the world by any standard measure, such as the Gini coefficient. Globalisation explains a lot of these trends. the participation by previously poor countries in the process of globalization has promoted their rapid growth. It does not matter what measure of human progress you take: infant mortality, maternal mortality, literacy, life expectancy, and so on. The improvements since 1980 have been vast, but also the gap between the rich and the poor has narrowed too. Of course, there are other inequality metrics. Globalization has probably been a factor that has led to the growth in the incomes and wealth of the top 1%. And inequality within countries has grown too. In countries that used to be poor, this is not surprising. If a country develops and everybody is living on the poverty line, people are not going to become richer at exactly the same speed. If North Korea begins to develop and people begin to become more prosperous, it will also become more unequal. These issues are worthy of discussion, but if we are interested in the state of the world as a whole, if we are interested in the huge numbers of people who struggle for day-to-day necessities, there is a good news story. By every measure of human progress, the poor are much better off, and the world as a whole is a more equal place.